Good morning, and thank you for attending this third webinar session in a series of 4 on making homes that work. My name is George Braddock, and I'm the Director of Creative Housing Solutions based out of Eugene, Oregon. And we'd like to acknowledge and thank the New York office for people with developmental disabilities for their sponsorship of these 4 webinars. In particular, we want to thank Dr. Lucinda Grant Griffin, who is the Director of the Office of Home and Community Living for the Office of People for Developmental Disabilities in the state of New York. Neither the state of New York nor Creative Housing Solutions receive compensation in any way for those materials that are presented or mentioned in this presentation. So this, as I say, is the third of a series of 4 webinars on making homes that work. The first session that we had was called The Environment Matters, and in that session we were making the case for the inclusion of the physical environment in person-centered planning. And oftentimes that particular element is overlooked in the planning session. We mostly think about delivering services to people with developmental disabilities, from a human perspective. So when there are issues, we sort of send in the troops, and we think about direct care workers, therapists, and psychologists, and other kinds of treatments. But we fail to recognize the critical role of the physical environment. And in that case, we recognize that the physical environment is actually a greater predictor of behavior, even in personality, that physical environments can coerce behaviors because they limit your choices and opportunities. So the idea that the physical environment should be part of person-centered planning, and we make the case for that in session 1. In session 2 is the broken environment, and there we were talking specifically about physical environments that didn't work, and a whole series of very creative and interesting ways of making walls that will withstand the testing of materials. We talk about the essential bathroom, the necessity of floor drains for people that have a particular interest in water. So we go along looking at environments that didn't work and provide with some interesting tools and opportunities for ways of addressing those issues. In today's session, session 3, we look at the role of the caregiver in the physical environment and how the physical environment can support the caregiver in their work. And we know that the vast majority of people with developmental disabilities are still residing with their families. And very often that caregiving responsibility falls to moms and dads and sometimes grandparents and occasionally people that come into the home to continue to do this work. So making sure that the caregiver is taken care of is as important as recognizing the needs of the individuals in the home and making sure that their lives are taken care of as well. So there are 4 key principles in each one of these sessions. So if you go away from this time together with nothing else than remembering and recognizing to take into consideration these 4 ideas when looking at the physical environment and people that are going to use them. And 1, people enter into relationships with their physical environments for better or for worse. And we all know about relationships, good ones and bad ones. And we want the relationship with the home to be a good one. We want it to be a supportive one. We want it to be one that really makes sense and works for the person that is living there and also for the people who are working there. I think it's important to recognize that the home, not only is it a living space for people with disabilities, but it's also a workplace for families that are providing the direct care in that home. That the difference between a problem behavior and a preferred activity are the negative consequences. So we talked a lot about how is it that a problem behavior becomes that? And it becomes that because Kyle jumps on the furniture, and ultimately the furniture gets broken. So the problem behavior is Kyle jumping on the furniture. But if you begin to unwrap that a little bit, and you realize that the real issue is that the furniture was broken. And what if you had furniture that Kyle could jump on, and then it didn't get broken? Then all of a sudden, Kyle jumping on the furniture, you rethink it, and it becomes a preferred activity, because there's no negative consequence of Kyle doing that work. So you don't have to restrain him or redirect him. You just simply rethink problem behavior. So it's a way of kind of taking a look at that particular question. You cannot fix a problem behavior in a broken environment. If the physical environment doesn't work and things begin to fail, this entire circumstance really shifts. It creates a lot of stress, and you're constantly in this kind of patch and reaction mode to the environment being broken. So it is important that you fix the problem, the physical environment first before addressing what oftentimes is then referred to as a problem behavior. And that the last thing, and probably the most important principle I'd like you to take away from this conversation is, if the physical environment does not work, it is not the person's fault. It is much easier to correct and to change and to fix a physical environment than it is to think that we can correct and change the individual, who, by the way, aren't broken anyway. So these are the 4 ideas that you'll see at work throughout this presentation and have been principal throughout all 4 of these webinars. Person-centered planning, has become, really the key tool in really rethinking how we have relationships with people with developmental disabilities. Rather than sort of looking at people as a whole class, or people with cerebral palsy, or people with autism, we've been to recognize that every single person with that diagnosis is first and foremost an individual, and that really creating lives for them must involve thinking about them as persons, thinking about what their needs are, what their dreams are, what their interests are, and then going about trying to satisfy those things. So in person-centered planning, when you think about how does that apply to the physical environment, there are some ideas that we believe are really important, and we're going to talk about them a lot through today's presentation. So person-centered planning, desired outcomes, keeps everyone safe. I mean, everyone has the right to be safe, both the individual and the person working with the individual, the neighbors, the community. Everyone has a fundamental right to be safe. Reduce stress and workload. If you can take stress and begin to take it out of the conversation, everything starts to change immediately. Because when you're stressed, your body enters into a physiological fight and flight kind of a mode. And your reasoning mind and your ability to do analytical thinking are actually denied you by the presence of cortisols and other kinds of chemicals in your bloodstream. So every time you can lower the stress level, it actually allows people to make better decisions. It allows the atmosphere of the home to really change. So reducing stress and reducing workload. People wear out. So every time you can save steps, every time you can have machines that are out ahead of you, every time you can have situations where things are taken care of, that isn't that many more steps. It's not that many more loads of laundry. It's not having to clean that couch for the 25th time. How can you start to take those work tasks and reduce that impact, which is ultimately what wears out caregivers. It's what wears out caregivers. And the state of Washington did an interesting study, and they were looking at who were the people that were leaving homes and coming into comprehensive care in the state of Washington. And the ones that were most likely to do it had a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder with co-occurring behaviors that required line of sight and within earshot distance to maintain. In other words, constant supervision, and moms and dads wore out, called caregiver fatigue. And that final one is usually the straw that breaks the camel's back. When moms and dads suddenly realize that they just can't do it anymore, that's when people end up in comprehensive care and the family home situation breaks down. Person-centered planning should reflect core values of equality. A person having a developmental disability doesn't make them any less a citizen, doesn't reduce any of their rights, and we should constantly hold that in mind and ask ourselves, how do we want to be treated in a situation, and then conduct ourselves accordingly. Increase people's independence, increase people's control. If people have more opportunity to do things for themselves, exercise more control, they feel more empowered in their lives, they feel more in control, and that is an important characteristic in terms of having the sort of life that you really want. I mean, we all want to be able to make choices and for those choices to be meaningful. Enable the person's preferred activities. What is it that Anna wants to do? What is it that Kyle wants to do? And sometimes we can forget that there should be some joy in life. And a lot of times that joy comes from being able to do the things you want to do. So how can we make a situation in person-centered planning, looking at environments that recognize that opportunity? Emphasize creativity. Every single situation has unique solutions because every person that we're working with is a unique individual. And we've found over the years that there are a number of things that we will do again and again in terms of modifying physical environments that make sense for people. But in each case, if it's the essential bathroom, there are certain core elements of the essential bathroom, but it needs to tweak a little bit. The color needs to be a certain way, how much control of the water. So there are reactions every time to what individual preferences are. And that requires creative thinking. And we're going to offer you some solutions, but you'll find your own. And if you're open to looking at other ways and other ways of discovering how to solve situations, that creativity will continue to create better situations. And provide caregivers an opportunity to rest and recharge. This idea of respite care, the critical importance of that, but can we find ways of creating situations where the stress is low, where I'm confident that Kyle's in the backyard and he's enjoying being on the swing, that I can actually step down, that I can be off duty for a minute and allow my own battery to recharge and my own energy to return. So these are really core principles in terms of thinking about person-centered planning and design for the physical environment. So the caregiver environment, addressing the most common challenges. So we did a survey here in Oregon with 125 families with individuals on autism spectrum disorder. And we asked them, what is the number 1, 2, 3, and 4? What are the things that most concern you? What are the greatest challenges you face every day? And the first one was fear of physical harm to self or others. Number 2, elopement. People leaving the situation without supervision, sometimes without the tools and the capacities to be on the street safely. The idea that people disappear. And any of us that are parents know that the most terrifying thing you can experience is suddenly your child was there and a moment later they were gone. And similarly for parents, the idea that, that someone might leave the home and you be unaware of it, great concern for that child's safety, even that adult's safety in the community. That the constant supervision and vigilance are required to keep the individual safe. And finally, the fourth biggest challenge is damage to the home. So if environments don't work, if environments do not work, you have to either intervene, redirect, or restrain. And I think it sort of makes sense on its face, but if someone is hurting themselves, something has to be done. And you're going to need to get engaged in that situation. If the wall is being broken, if the bathroom is being flooded, if someone is outside and heading toward the street and there's no gate and there are cars on the street. So in any kind of situation that requires that people's safety be cared for, and you remember that first and foremost concern of all families were harm to self and others, you will find ways of addressing that situation, and it involves restraint. In this photograph here you can see actual locks on the bedroom door. I've been in homes where the doors of siblings are locked so that Kyle wouldn't necessarily go into their room at night and either bother them or sometimes do damage to their property. So people need to find a way to get through life. And they do things, and sometimes they do things that are very unsafe because they don't have other choices. They may not know that there are other possibilities out there. And again, can you be on duty 24 hours a day, 365 days a year? You can't. And so sometimes they resort to mechanical solutions to that problem that might include things like locking bedroom doors or putting bars on the windows that make it impossible to go out the window, or beds that the child can be put in the bed and the bed actually secured, or family members that sometimes end up holding each other down. But a safe and supportive physical environment can create other opportunities for providing that kind of safe and healthy support without some of the measures that we just shown. So when you do an analysis, you want to say, what's the first and most important thing? You want to eliminate the obvious hazards in the home. So a supportive environment is a safe environment. It addresses personal risks and dangers. And this could be anything from leaving the front yard and ending up on the street, to individuals that might turn on hot water and step into the shower or get into the bathtub and be scalded. A number of things, people that might test the strength of materials that will hit a window and break a window or break a mirror. So kind of doing an analysis of what are potential dangers to the individual. Access to poisons or chemicals maybe need to be addressed. Install finishes that are durable and easy to clean. This is back to this idea of how do we reduce the stress and the workload on caregivers. So counters that are easy to take care of, walls that can be washed repeatedly. A standard sheetrock wall with 2 coats of finish on it, even in a high gloss paint, will only put up with about 40 washes before you're through the paint. At 60 washes, you're beginning to disturb the paper. And above that number, you're starting to actually get into the gypboard itself. So you can't just clean, a standard wall endlessly. You need to have walls that are going to put up with those kinds of surface treatments and will sometimes put up with disinfectants and so forth. Provide opportunity for control. The more control people have in their lives, the less stress there are. You really want to create as many opportunities for people to control the situations, to make choices as you can. Anticipate unconventional use of things. Now, oftentimes people don't use things in the way we would typically imagine that they would. There may be a whole bunch of different ways that people use the bathroom. Toilet fixations, for example, something that we see quite commonly. The toilet will get stuffed and repeatedly flushed and flushed and flushed. So they're anticipating that there may be situations where people are going to use the house differently. Light switches that go on and on and on and off and on and off and on and off. They're not designed for that. And it may be something that we need to address in terms of, are there some physical environmental modifications that can help reduce that circumstance. Anticipate water play. It is so common, that water and being able to get to water and interact with water has a really positive calming effect on people with autism spectrum disorder, that you just need to sort of assume that it's going to happen. Address problem doors, and that is doors that are exiting, doors that get slammed, doors where you don't want people in certain areas of the space for their own safety. So looking at doors throughout the building, alternatives to regular swing doors, something to have in consideration, and select appropriate furnishings. And once again, things that might be easy to keep clean, things that aren't going to be easily damaged if people bounce on the furniture or use them in unconventional ways. So this is the whole idea about looking at a physical environment that is more supportive, that begins to address those concerns that families expressed in relationship to harm to self or others, elopement, inappropriate use of the building, or damage to the building. Harm to self and others, there's a very, very not an unusual circumstance. People get stressed, people become have a bad day. Who knows what the circumstance is? We all have those experiences, and sometimes they result in circumstances where the physical environment gets tested. In this case, you see a situation where Carl would actually sit on the couch and bang his head on the wall to the point where he made those kinds of holes, or injuries because of rough use. So this whole idea of people hurting themselves or hurting others is something to be thought about. And are there environmental characteristics that can support preventing these types of injuries? So if a person is likely to test glass, for example, and in Wilson's case, he liked to break windows, and he liked everything about that. He liked the sound of it, and he particularly liked the reaction that happened when he would start to go toward the window, knowing that the window was in danger. So when you went to their house, there were always blinds over the windows, there were levolor blinds, and there were curtains inside of that, so that if Wilson couldn't see the window very often, he wouldn't target it. But when he would, Mom would have to get between Wilson and the windows, because he would get to the window, and there had been occasions when he had put his hand through the window, shards of glass end up in his arm, he ends up in the emergency room, and there's this major crisis that unfolds. So Mom ends up putting herself between Wilson and the window. So then Wilson ends up doing some damage to Mom, and in this case, he would often bite Mom, and those are bite marks on Mom's arm. So back to that slide, it says, you will intervene, you will redirect, or you will restrain. Here, Mom had to get in between that situation. You can change that window glass to tempered glass, and Wilson banging on that tempered glass is likely not only not to break the glass, but if the glass does break, the shards that come from the glass are squared and they're basically harmless. So it's a way of addressing that stressor on moms and other caregivers by taking some of the risk that they have to endure away from the situation. Elopement, the number two fear. The number two fear. Noah's going to get out, and Noah would get out of the house. He would go out the second-story bedroom window, and he would go across the roof and slide down the post, and he'd make his way to the front yard and through the front yard gate and onto the street. And then he would cross a 4-lane highway to get to the elementary school on the other side of the highway because it had great swing sets. And what Noah really wanted to do was go over there and play on those swings. That's what he loved to do. And he, of course, would get up in the middle of the night and do this. And this, again, moms and dads can't be awake 24 hours a day. So in this case, they actually put screws through Noah's second-story window so that he couldn't get out the window. Well, one of the problems related to that is it becomes a potential life, health, and safety risk. If you had a fire in the building and a person can't exit the window, then you have a situation that could have a really tragic ending. In this case, what we realized is that what Noah really wanted to do was get to a swing set. So by creating a situation where that swing set and the way he wanted to use it was available to him in his backyard, he could go directly to that and potentially not feel like the need to get across the street to the other swing set. Other experiences where people have tried to deal with elopement can result in things like literally putting expanded metal or bars on bedroom windows to completely close off the window. And as I've said earlier, we don't want to make decisions, we don't want to do things in the physical environment that set it up in such a way that we create the potential for a really bad thing to happen. So doors are very often, as we all know, the gateway internally, but also the gateway to the outside. And doors can become a really major issue. And very often I go to family homes, and early on they can simply put the slide bolt up very high on the door, and Noah can't reach the slide bolt. But as Noah gets older, he starts figuring out things like he can push a chair up against the door and move the slide bolt. So then some of those little locking mechanisms become more sophisticated. They become little chain locks. But all the way along, if what I really want to do is get out that door, I'm going to continue to figure out ways to do it. So then we start getting to the point where we start putting deadbolt arrangements on the doors. Well, then you got to remember where the key is, and somebody's always looking for the key. So then it starts out with one deadbolt and one key, and then it ends up going to 2 and 3, and in this case there were 4 different deadbolts on that front door to keep him from exiting, because it was really difficult to find all 4 keys to get out of the house. And finally, at a certain point, he just sort of said, to hell with the keys, and he just took the whole door off the hinges. So what are some of the alternatives to this? And one that we found that was pretty successful is what's called an electronic strike. And an electronic strike is mounted into the jamb of the door. So you put in a reinforced door jamb, and this strike goes in there. And then it operates off of an electronically actuated lock. And that lock could have a keypad code, or it could be any number of ways that that lock could be functioned. But the interesting thing here is that that system is tied into the electrical panel of the house and also to the smoke detector system. So that if a smoke detector went off in the house or there was loss of electricity in the house, the first thing that would happen is that electronic strike releases and the door opens up. So this is a way to start to try to address some of those issues of health and safety, at the same time addressing the issue of not wanting a person to get outside of the house, potentially into more dangerous situations unless adequate supervision is available for that to happen. So this is creating some alternatives to what families get desperate about doing. And there are really tragic stories of families that have locked their loved ones in the house, and there's been loss of life because they couldn't get out of the building. Smartphones, have revolutionized all of our lives, and more apps and technologies available on smartphones that, again, make it easier for people to have the adequate amount of control and of supervision and responsibility with less and less being invasive. So, when little cameras first came out and you could put cameras any place and have a monitor, they started showing up in homes all over the place. But we sort of ask ourselves, back to that notion of sort of equality, you think about your own home and when do you want a camera on you? And the question starts to be, what do I need to know from that camera? And are there other ways of getting that information? Maybe what I really need to know is, did the bedroom window open? And maybe that's okay. But what I really want to know is the bedroom opened and Kyle went out the bedroom window. That's what I want to know. So does that mean I need to have a camera in Kyle's room all the time to determine that? I don't think so. With the smartphone, you can have remote video cameras set outside the room that would tell you that information. Motion and sensing contacts that say windows partly open, windows all the way open. So that along that trail, it's about reacting to real information. Because just cracking the window may be a perfectly okay thing to do. But it's not necessarily a perfectly good thing to do when the window comes all the way open at 3 o'clock in the morning. Then you've got to respond to that situation because something's going to happen. And it's things down to touch mats, knowing when people have gotten up and gone to the bathroom, have they done that repeatedly? So this whole collection of various kinds of information gathering devices that all can be linked to your cell phone, so that you get real-time information and, again, allows your stress level to come down at the same time, not neglecting your responsibility toward making sure that that person is able to stay safe in the home and in the community. So we talk about places of control and layers of freedom. I did a project a number of years in Palm Springs, and we were helping move a number of people that had been living in an institution there into housing and community. And the provider that I was working with there, we were talking about safeguards and about security and this whole issue of people leaving the home and elopement and so forth. And he said, how does a person ever learn to exercise freedom appropriately if they've never had any? And very often we create situations where people's choices to do things are really limited. And yet we believe that somehow the exercise of freedom just will naturally come to you and that you will exercise it appropriately. So I think if you rethink that, much as you unwrap a problem behavior, taking time to understand that people need some experience, that they need to develop some capacities, that they need some support along the way so that new freedoms are exercised appropriately. So when you begin to think about this environmentally, there are layers of freedom, and we think that creating safe places that are predictable is one of those ways that people are able to exercise control in their lives and develop the capacity to exercise freedom appropriately. Eliminate fears and triggers. Sharing control. Sharing control in a situation requires judgment. And that's not something that is so necessarily easily defined or laid out on a grid saying that if this happens, this happens, this happens. It's really about looking at the situation, looking at the individual, and creating those opportunities so as more control is possible, more opportunities to exercise that control become available. And if it's a mom and dad in a home, or it's a person providing care in a congregative situation, or whatever that circumstance, oftentimes it boils down to the judgment of the individual and allowing people more opportunity to exercise control and having physical environments that you can sort of continue to create more and more of those opportunities along the way. And then making the home a preferred place. So we think about this in layers. The most important layer is making the home secure, the fenced yard, which is areas of varied security, and then finally the most highly dangerous places are potentially the street and beyond. Creating a destination with a preferred activity often works really well. So when Noah left, where did he want to go? Well, Noah, where he wanted to go was across the street to the swing set. By providing a swing set in his yard, it gave him that opportunity to find the activity that he wanted. So when he got out of the house, he tended to go to the swing set and play on the swing set. So creating different situations where there are interesting things for people to do in the yard or in the home, and they're going to be drawn to those situations when they leave the house. And if that's the case, once again, caregivers can stand down. I mean, if I know that when Anna goes out the back door, that she's going to go and get on the swing and ride the swing, that she's going to play with some of the things that are arranged for her in the backyard because she's a person that loves water play, from a care provider's perspective, I can stand down. I can relax because I know that Anna is safe in the backyard and that she's doing the things that she wants to do. Fencing. Now, fencing is that mechanical stop that in some cases needs to exist between those highly dangerous areas that require supervision before a person goes there. Also, fences can provide privacy for us, but they shouldn't be, the idea that we're just going to fence a person in, I think really falls short of what our goals are. We really want a situation where we can be certain that safety and privacy is protected, but that we don't use that as the end of the game. That we really are trying to create not only interesting things in that situation to do, but we want to continue to build capacity so that people can move beyond those areas. Some pretty interesting fencing arrangements. When you get off of the front yard, you can actually get fences a little bit taller. You can sometimes get that case made very effectively with what are called sports fences. So in a typical residential situation, 6-foot high fence is all the code will allow. Sometimes even shorter than that in the front yard, very often 4 feet. But on side yards and backyards, 6 foot is the standard limit. And if you get beyond that, you can sort of get into trouble with the building officials. But when it comes to sports fences, which are actually made out of netting, you can get those up as high as 14 feet. And so they're very effective both for keeping balls in the backyard, but also really effective in preventing people from going over the fences. So what about multifamily situations? So as we move more and more toward anticipating and encouraging more diversity in community, that more and more people that would have traditionally ended up in group home settings or leaving their family homes, where are they going? So I think we're beginning to see more and more opportunities within multifamily situations, in apartment buildings where there are set-aside units for people with disability. You're starting to see it in duplexes. So what are some of the provisions that we might need to begin to think about in order for people to be successful in community? So we know that right at about 50% of people with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder do in fact have co-occurring behaviors that will include aggression, obsessive compulsive disorders, sometimes property destruction. So, this is not saying that this is going on all the time, but these are characteristics of individuals, and you need to create physical fabric that supports that. And, in our session on the broken home, we talk a lot about creating walls that will put up with testing and different door systems and so forth. But when you begin to think about how does that work in community, what are some of the things that you need to do in community to make those individuals that sometimes, go beyond the bounds of what we might think of as sort of typical use. So this is a multifamily situation where there was a duplex, and the idea here was how could you create an opportunity for Kurt to come and go to his unit, and at the same time not necessarily have to interface or engage with people that were living on the second floor of this duplex. So the design allowed an opportunity with the use of various doors for Kurt to be able to enter his residence without necessarily gaining access to the staircase that led to the second floor. So it provided privacy and security for the people on the second floor. At the same time, gave Kurt that opportunity so that in those days when Kurt was having a bad time, it could be managed in a good way. And then sometimes Kurt would get very aggressive and really get after his staff in the house. And how can you create an opportunity for staff to remain in position of providing that ultimate level of security and support without necessarily putting themselves in danger? We know that the number one cause of injury is person-to-person contact, and there are times when you need to create just space And sometimes just doing that will defuse the situation. So in this case, we created a secondary exiting situation that still allowed the staff to remain in close proximity to the circumstance without necessarily creating an opportunity for Kurt to enter the broader community and potentially get into trouble. So it's a way of, once again, thinking about how can you create situations where people that have higher care needs can actually coexist in the general community successfully. Increasing visibility and connections throughout spaces. Back to the idea of, how can we save steps? How can we reduce the workload on moms and dads? And one of those things is being able to just look around and be aware of what's happening. So I could take a situation where when Anna was in the backyard and Mom was in the kitchen, she couldn't see the backyard from the kitchen or from the dining room. But something as simple as putting in a window at that position enabled Mom to remain doing the things that she was doing in the kitchen, for regular dining activity and kitchen table activity to take place, and she could look out that window and see that Anna was in the backyard and was doing fine. So that way of connecting the home so that you can get views through the home to what's going on in the home saves steps, and every time that it does that, it really encourages people to be more independent. If I'm constantly checking on you, it gets to be the situation where whatever it was I was doing, I'm now doing something else because now you've entered my space. And we get into this relationship, either for better or worse. So ways of being aware of what's happening in the house, being connected to it without not necessarily having to physically go there. And this is a situation where a person sitting in the dining area of the house has a view completely through the building into Colin's living area, beyond to the backyard, into the kitchen and the laundry beyond. So it's almost like creating what we call catbird seats, which is a place where you can be doing your own activities, be on the phone, whatever you need to be doing, and yet have that commanding view of the house. This is a technique that we've actually employed a number of times, and in this case, it's like at night, Carl would get up at night and he would go around the various plumbing fixtures in the house and he put little balls of paper down the drains. And he would come home from school and his pockets would be all bulging out and he'd be full of these little balls of paper. And he'd get up at night and he'd go and he'd very, very carefully plug all the drains in the house, which gave them a standing order with the local Roto-Rooter company who would come out and having to many times clean the drains. We solved that problem in some ways by creating these little stainless steel screens that went into the drains that could then be removed and the little balls of paper dumped out, because Carl had to get up and go and put these little balls of paper in the drains. It wasn't a choice. And when I asked Carl, well, why do you do that? He said, because I have to. And sometimes we just have to accept that answer. We just have to accept the answer. That's what he had to do. So one of the things that we came up with was a strategy whereby between Carl's room and the house, there was a hallway. And off of that hallway, there was a door that went from this living suite into the house, and then there was a door that went right into his mom and dad's bedroom. So at night, they would lock the door into the hallway. So that if Carl needed to get up and go and put the balls of paper down the drains, he'd actually have to pass through mom and dad's room in order to do that. And mom and dad could wake up and intervene. And this technique has been used repeatedly, and we called it the gatekeeper. So for individuals that are active at night, that people that sometimes have eating disorders and they're compelled to get to the kitchen and find the food, this is a way of not necessarily locking them in to an area, totally restricting their ability to move, being able to react to what they need because they have to pass through mom and dad's area on the way to what they're wanting to do next. Tools for good housekeeping. Keeping things clean and smelling good. Any building that you go into, any home that you go into, all of us tend to judge that home by how it smells. And that's just a natural human instinct. And keeping a home smelling nice, particularly if you're dealing with incontinence, you're dealing with some of the other behaviors that might occur, co-occurring medical issues. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And reducing the workload, once again, is a priority in terms of taking care of caregivers. So when you think about making it easy to take care of the house, what are some of the things that you want to do? Well, you want to make sure that you've got adequate storage. You want to limit the opportunity for clutter to migrate. And the interesting thing about clutter is that clutter grows more clutter. So if you start off with a small pile of clothes in the corner, before you know it, it's a medium-sized pile of clothes in the corner, and the next time you turn around, it's a big pile of clothes in the corner. So if you start off with a situation where things are tidy, they're put away, they're organized, it tends to stay that way. It's like an object in motion tends to remain in motion. Clutter tends to grow more clutter. Building in routines so that when clothes come off, they go into the basket, so that you create routines for where does the dishes go, and have the physical environment set up in a way that is predictable and it supports those routines being carried out. Sometimes controlling negative smells, bad smells, can be done by pressurizing the house in a way that causes air from one particular part of the house to go out that part of the house. So you can put smoke seals on the doors, put exhaust fans in that part of the building, and negatively exit the air from that part of the building, which means that the rest of the air from the house are going to be drawn through the building and go out that room. So people with incontinence, some smearing behaviors, some of those behaviors that really create bad smells in the home, that's one way of managing them. And then making it easy to do the right thing. Make it easy to clean up the spill, make it easy to wipe off the wall, make it easy to sanitize the counter, make it easy to put things away. Appropriate storage helps prevent the migration and the continued accumulation of clutter. Oftentimes choices like this are made because they have limited how you can store things that don't end up being everywhere. So this is, everything that comes home when in this room, the door was closed and locked. And so when you went through the house, there weren't many personal belongings in the house because they were all piled up in this one room. But and these are some of the experiences that you might find in a bedroom, where the piles of clothes in the corner grow more clothes in the corner, things become disorganized in the room, the closet doesn't work very well. So these are challenges to housekeeping. So if you as a parent or a caregiver enter this room and that's how it looks, it's like, how do you start? And how do you continue to manage that day in and day out and prevent the situation beginning to look like this? Because when the place starts to look bad, Anna's mom talks about, my house looked like a war zone, people become discouraged. And in that discouragement, losing that energy and that enthusiasm for continuing to do the work of caregiving gets harder. And to do that work compassionately, even more challenging. So creating built-in closet situations, where there's a place for things and everything goes to a place, drawers and so forth that can be secured inside of a closet arrangement. And in this particular case, in Ronnie's house, it started out where that door was actually securable, and clothes for the day were available in the top drawer and on the hanging rack. And over time, as Ronnie became better and better at selecting his clothes and at managing them, this situation opened up more and more. But it did create that place for clutter to go, a way to organize it and to keep it from spreading in the room. So doors providing additional storage and secured door when it was necessary. And again, it's back to this idea of shared control, and there are times when that's really important. And it's about judgment, because if at the end of the day you just close the door and lock it, I think we have failed to support a person in a way that is possible. Another example of a fairly significant amount of damage in the living area of Wilson's house. And so here's an alternative that creates a really durable wall situation. Conventional sheetrock, as we learned in the broken environment, only has 65 psi of surface strength. And you can put your fist through it if you want to. You can certainly put a knee through it you could dig through it with a pencil. The wall surfaces of sheetrock, even with the best of paints, are really not designed for continual washing. And they aren't going to put up with the kind of impact furniture being knocked up against them, which is why you end up with rooms that look like that. In this case, you've got a reinforced wall situation and fiberglass reinforced plastic on the surface that's endlessly cleanable, can be purchased in all kinds of different colors, can be painted, and there are a number of different finished surfaces that you can apply that look very nice. You don't walk into the home and feel like you're in a McDonald's store. And also selection of furniture that's easy to clean and easy to take care of. This particular furnishing here has a fabric on the couch that's a ballistic nylon fabric that is extremely durable, very washable, doesn't stain, and is easy to keep clean. And you literally can't puncture it with even a pair of scissors. Bad smells, one of the more difficult things to deal with in a home, and we talked about some of the strategies, including negatively pressurizing rooms, selecting materials that are easy to clean and easy to sanitize. As you go further down that road, there are exhaust fans with humidity sensors that can be installed in bathrooms. And once again, if you can put things in place that are automatic, that then you don't have to worry about them, you can check them off the list. So when you leave the bathroom and you've assisted someone in the bathroom, as long as there's moisture in the bathroom, the sensor on the fan senses that and continues to operate until the moisture level is dropped below a certain point, and then it shuts itself off automatically. You want to look at really quiet fans, and there are very low zone fans out there that you can't even barely tell that they're operating at all, and they're definitely worth the investment. Putting operable windows in bedrooms or in bathrooms, it used to be a code requirement not that many years ago, but a lot of office buildings and apartments in particular started putting all the bathrooms in the center of the building, so they had to rely on fans. But whenever possible, we want to be able to introduce fresh air and light to particularly to bathroom situations. It makes them cleaner and healthier places to be. HEPA air filtration systems can pick up even cigarette smokes and other odors and filter them out. These can be aftermarket added to air systems. They have free standalone units that can be in place. So a really pretty successful technique for dealing with smells in the home. And then of course providing airtight canisters with filters, so that if you're doing incontinence work and changing diapers, there's a place that those things go and that they're sealed so that that smell doesn't get into the building right from the beginning. Floor surfaces that don't absorb smells, staying away from carpets, going to vinyl plank flooring systems. There are some really interesting systems now that have acoustic backs on them, so that you're getting some soundproofing kinds of benefit from the floor. At the same time, they look attractive. The new generation of vinyl plank flooring and other kinds of artificial floor surfaces have gone generations beyond the way they used to be, the old Pergos and so forth, to really where they're very high quality, good looking floor systems that are easy to take care of, easy to keep clean, and they don't absorb smells. So back to one of the things that we started at the beginning of this conversation is, how do you keep moms and dads from just wearing out? In Washington and other places around the country, they've learned that caregiver fatigue very often is the final straw that means that moms and dads just get to a place where they can't do it anymore. And in this particular situation, this was Kai's mom, and Kai was a young man. When we worked with him, he was 7 years old and had a lot of bowel issues, not uncommon in people with autism spectrum disorder. He had extreme incontinence and was really a major factor in his health. And mom was determined and an incredible hardworking mom, and you'd go to that house, and in spite of those issues, it was amazing the amount of cleaning that she had to do, because every morning in his bedroom and several times a day, she was confronted with the result of this degree of incontinence and so forth. So she spent a lot of time just like that on her knees. And her physical environment, it didn't work for her. And she too was wearing down and wrote and said, I don't know how much longer I can continue to do this work. She had to do a lot of laundry, as you can well imagine, connected to incontinence. And this was her laundry room. And this was a laundry room that didn't work for her. There was no laundry tray. Dealing with solids, conventional plumbing is not really designed to do that. Conventional washers and dryers are not set up with appropriate sanitation cycles. So overwhelmed by bed sheets and towels and area rugs constantly having to be washed and sanitized, the laundry room literally just became unworkable for her. So there were a couple of key changes that took place in the laundry room. What's called a batch style sink was installed with a 4-inch drain that enabled her to clean the initial rinsing of soiled linens and not be plugging the drains and not having to handle that. At the same time, improved storage for the wet materials before they went into the washer and dryer, and then highly commercial washers and dryers with sanitation cycles that really enabled the kind of appropriate care of the materials that she was accumulating, soil materials she's accumulating every single day in supporting her son. He had a lot of incontinence through the night in his bedroom, and every morning she was greeted with messes on the floors, on the walls, in the bed sheets, and came along with a whole series of strategies for dealing with that level of care need. And they included a hot and cold hose bib in the wall with a wire, an extending faucet and hose that enabled her to literally wash down the floor in the bedroom. They put an industrial commercial grade, what's called hard good vinyl in the bedroom, coving the vinyl up the wall, and then installed a floor drain in the middle of the bedroom so that she could literally squeegee and chase the liquid down the floor drain. Control of plumbing at the outside wall with a locked up cabinet to keep it secure so that he wouldn't get into it and mess with it at the night. And he had a real interest in all things that he could get into, so being able to secure those items through the day and through the night when he was in the room was really important. So by putting these physical tools in place at mom's disposal, suddenly the activity of being greeted in that room every single morning, although still difficult, was far less daunting, and was able to complete that task relatively easily and healthily and not on her hands and knees in a matter of 30 minutes than as opposed to the hour and a half that it had taken previously. So back to this whole idea as you start to look at person-centered designs and taking into consideration the needs of caregivers and how important it is to take care of their health and safety, to reduce their stress and reduce their workload, looking at the kinds of values that need to be in place and the outcomes that we're looking for from our physical environment. So we'll conclude now with the repeat of the very first slide, which are the principles that we look at all of our work on the physical environment, and those include recognition that people enter relationships for better or worse with their physical environments, that we can unwrap a problem behavior, and oftentimes we find it is the negative consequences that are really at issue. You cannot fix a problem behavior in a broken environment, and if the environment doesn't work, it is first and foremost not the person's fault. Thank you very much.